Steve Harvey had received thousands of messages from former Family Feud contestants over his 15 years of hosting the show. Birthday wishes, thank you notes, updates about prize spending, even the occasional wedding invitation. But the phone call that came through to his assistant on a rainy Thursday afternoon in October 2024 was different. The voice on the other end was trembling, desperate, and familiar in a way that made his assistant immediately patch it through to Steve's private line. What Steve heard in that conversation would lead him on a journey that reminded him why television could still change lives, why some connections transcended the boundaries between host and contestant, and why sometimes the most powerful moments happened long after the cameras stopped rolling. Before we continue with this incredible story, if you appreciate real stories about compassion and second chances, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring content about the moments that restore our faith in humanity. The caller was Marcus Thompson, a 58-year-old veteran from Detroit who had appeared on Family Feud 3 years earlier with his family. Steve remembered the episode clearly because Marcus had been different from most contestants. He carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had served his country for 23 years in the Army, retiring as a master sergeant after tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. During the family introduction segment, Marcus had stood tall in his dress uniform, which he wore to honor the men he had served with. His wife Patricia, his 2 adult daughters, and his teenage son had surrounded him with obvious pride and affection. They had not won that day, losing in the final round by just 12 points, but Marcus had shaken Steve's hand afterward and thanked him for treating his family with respect and dignity. Steve had been touched by the man's grace in defeat and had spent a few extra minutes talking with the family after taping concluded. Now, 3 years later, Marcus was calling because his world had collapsed in ways that made losing a game show seem insignificant. His voice cracked as he explained the situation to Steve. 6 months earlier, Marcus had been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The prognosis was grim, with doctors giving him perhaps 12 to 18 months. But Marcus was not calling about his own situation. He was calling about his son Jerome, who was now 17 years old and facing a crisis that had broken his father's heart. Jerome had been accepted to the United States Military Academy at West Point, achieving a dream that Marcus had harbored for his son since the boy was young enough to understand what service meant. The appointment was everything Marcus had worked toward in raising his son. It represented values, discipline, opportunity, and a path to becoming the kind of leader who could make a difference in the world. But there was a problem that threatened to destroy everything. The academy required a comprehensive medical examination and complete family medical history. When Jerome submitted his father's recent cancer diagnosis as part of that history, the academy's medical board had raised concerns. Pancreatic cancer had genetic factors, and the board was questioning whether Jerome should be approved for admission given the potential hereditary risk. They had not rejected him outright, but they had placed his file in administrative review, which meant his appointment was in jeopardy. The review process could take months, potentially past the enrollment deadline. Marcus had consulted with lawyers, written letters, submitted additional medical documentation, but nothing seemed to move the bureaucracy. His son's dream was dying in paperwork while Marcus himself was dying from disease. Steve Harvey listened to all of this without interrupting, his heart growing heavier with each detail. When Marcus finally finished explaining the situation, there was silence on the line for several seconds. Then Marcus said something that would haunt Steve for weeks afterward. "Mr. Harvey, I know this isn't your problem. I know you meet hundreds of families, and you can't help everyone who calls. But I'm running out of time, and I don't know who else to turn to. My son worked so hard for this opportunity. He maintained a 4.0 grade average for 4 years. He was captain of his ROTC unit. He volunteers at the VA hospital every weekend. He earned this appointment through merit, not connections. And now it might be taken away because of my cancer, because of something completely beyond his control. I just thought maybe, if you knew someone, if you could make a call, anything that might help get his file reviewed faster." The desperation in Marcus's voice was palpable, but it was mixed with something else that struck Steve deeply. There was no anger, no sense of entitlement, no demand for special treatment. There was simply a father's love for his son and a soldier's understanding that sometimes you had to ask for help when the mission was too important to fail alone. Steve made a decision in that moment that would require him to step outside his usual role, to leverage relationships and influence in ways he rarely did. But he knew this was exactly the kind of situation where having a platform meant having a responsibility. "Marcus," Steve said quietly, "you give me 24 hours, I'm going to make some calls. I can't promise anything, but I'm going to try." The relief in Marcus's response was immediate and overwhelming. He thanked Steve repeatedly, his voice breaking with emotion. Steve could hear Patricia crying in the background. When they finally hung up, Steve sat in his office for several minutes, processing what he had just agreed to attempt. He had friends who had served in the military, business associates with connections to various government agencies, but this was delicate territory. He could not simply call in favors to circumvent legitimate medical concerns. What he could do, however, was ensure that Jerome's case received fair and expedited consideration rather than being lost in bureaucratic delays. Steve started making calls that afternoon. His first was to a retired general he had met at a charity event 2 years earlier. The general listened carefully to the situation and agreed that it seemed like an administrative delay rather than a legitimate medical disqualification. He provided Steve with the name of someone at the Department of Defense who oversaw medical reviews for service academy appointments. Steve's second call was to that contact, a physician who specialized in military medicine. Steve explained the situation carefully, emphasizing that he was not asking for special treatment, but rather for an expedited review of Jerome Thompson's medical file to ensure that a qualified candidate did not lose his appointment due to administrative delays rather than legitimate medical concerns. The physician was professional and noncommittal, but Steve could tell he was listening. He promised to look into the case and see if there was anything that could be done to accelerate the review process. Steve made 2 more calls that day, one to a senator he had interviewed on his talk show who sat on the Armed Services Committee, and another to the superintendent of West Point, whom he had never met, but whose office agreed to pass along his message. In each conversation, Steve was careful to explain that he was advocating for fair process, not special treatment. He acknowledged that if there were legitimate medical reasons to deny Jerome's appointment, those concerns should be respected. But he emphasized that a young man who had earned his place through merit should not be penalized for factors completely beyond his control, particularly when his father was facing a terminal illness. 24 hours later, Steve called Marcus back. He was honest about what he had done and what might happen. "Marcus, I made some calls to people who can potentially help expedite the review of Jerome's file. I can't guarantee any particular outcome, but I made sure that the right people know about your son's situation and understand that this is time-sensitive given your diagnosis. Now we need to wait and see if those conversations make a difference." Marcus thanked Steve again, his gratitude evident despite the uncertainty. Over the next 2 weeks, Steve checked in with Marcus every few days. There was no news from West Point, and Marcus's health was declining noticeably. His voice grew weaker with each call, his breathing more labored. Steve could hear the exhaustion in his pauses, the effort it took to maintain hope when his body was failing. Then, 18 days after Steve's initial call to Marcus, the breakthrough came. Jerome received notification that his medical file had been fully reviewed by a special board, and his appointment to West Point had been approved without conditions. The medical board had determined that while pancreatic cancer could have hereditary factors, there was no evidence of genetic predisposition in Jerome's case, and his own health examinations showed no concerns that would affect his ability to serve. The administrative review was complete, and Jerome was cleared to report for basic training in June. When Marcus called Steve with the news, he was sobbing so hard he could barely speak. Patricia took the phone and explained what had happened, her own voice thick with tears. Steve felt his own eyes welling up as he listened. This was not about him or his influence or his celebrity. This was about a father who would now get to see his son achieve a dream before his time ran out. But Steve was not satisfied with a phone call. 2 days later, he flew to Detroit unannounced. He arrived at the Thompson family home in the afternoon, accompanied by a small camera crew from his production company. When Marcus opened the door and saw Steve standing there, he actually stumbled backward in shock. "Mr. Harvey, what are you doing here?" Steve smiled and stepped inside. "Marcus, I couldn't let this moment pass without being here in person. Your son is going to West Point. That's something worth celebrating face to face." What followed was one of the most emotional afternoons Steve had experienced in his entire career. The Thompson family gathered in their modest living room, and Steve sat with them for over 3 hours. He listened as Marcus talked about his military service, the men he had lost in combat, the values he had tried to instill in his children. He watched as Jerome, a tall young man with his father's bearing and his mother's gentle eyes, described his preparation for West Point and what the appointment meant to him. Steve saw the way Patricia looked at her husband, the mixture of love and grief in her expression as she faced the reality that their time together was measured in months rather than years. The camera crew captured all of it, but this was not about creating content. This was about bearing witness to a family's courage in the face of terminal illness and celebrating a victory that transcended any game show prize. Before leaving, Steve did something that surprised even his own production team. He announced that his foundation would be establishing a scholarship in Marcus Thompson's name to help children of terminally ill veterans attend college. The scholarship would provide full tuition, room, and board for 4 years to one qualifying student annually. Marcus was overwhelmed, trying to protest that such a gesture was too much, but Steve was insistent. "Marcus, you spent 23 years serving this country. You raised a son who represents the best of what military service can produce. Your legacy deserves to live on beyond your time here, and this scholarship will make sure it does." The footage from that visit would later be edited into a special segment for Steve's talk show. But the full raw footage was given to the Thompson family as a gift, hours of memories captured during a precious time. Over the following months, Steve stayed in close contact with the Thompson family. He called Marcus weekly, their conversations growing shorter as Marcus's strength faded, but no less meaningful. They talked about fatherhood, about legacy, about faith and fear, and finding peace. Marcus shared stories from his military service, insights about leadership and sacrifice that Steve found profound. In one conversation that Steve would never forget, Marcus told him, "You know what the hardest part of dying is, Mr. Harvey? It's not the pain or the fear. It's knowing you won't be there for the moments that matter. I won't see Jerome graduate from West Point. I won't walk my daughters down the aisle. I won't hold my grandchildren. But knowing that Jerome will have his chance, that he'll serve with honor, that gives me peace I didn't think I could find." Marcus Thompson passed away in March 2025, 4 months after Jerome's West Point appointment was confirmed. He had lived long enough to see his son receive his official acceptance letter, to help him prepare for the challenges ahead, to share final wisdom about service and sacrifice. The funeral was held at a military cemetery in Detroit, and Steve Harvey attended despite having to cancel a taping to be there. He sat in the back, not wanting to draw attention from the family's grief, but Patricia saw him and insisted he sit with them. During the service, Jerome delivered a eulogy for his father that had grown men openly weeping. He spoke about integrity, about duty, about a man who had faced death with the same courage he had shown in combat. He acknowledged Steve Harvey's role in helping secure his West Point appointment, calling it an act of compassion that had given his father peace in his final months. After the service, as the crowd dispersed, Jerome approached Steve with something in his hand. It was his father's military challenge coin, a bronze medallion that Marcus had carried through multiple deployments. "My dad wanted you to have this," Jerome said, his voice steady despite the tears on his face. "He said you understood what service really meant, even though you never wore a uniform. He said you served people in a different way, and that mattered just as much." Steve accepted the coin, knowing he was holding something sacred, a symbol of a bond that had transcended the typical relationship between television host and viewer. The following June, Steve Harvey attended Jerome Thompson's induction ceremony at West Point. He sat in the audience at Maishi Stadium as Jerome and his fellow new cadets took their oath of service, raising their right hands and swearing to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. Patricia was there with her daughters, and they all cried together as they watched Jerome begin the journey his father had dreamed of for him. After the ceremony, Steve had a private moment with Jerome. The young man stood in his dress gray uniform, looking every bit the future officer his father had envisioned. "Your father would be so proud of you today," Steve told him. Jerome nodded, composing himself before responding. "He's here, Mr. Harvey. I feel him with me. And I know part of the reason I'm standing here is because you cared enough to make those phone calls when he asked for help. I won't forget that. I promise you, I will honor this opportunity every single day." True to his word about the scholarship, Steve Harvey's foundation launched the Master Sergeant Marcus Thompson Memorial Scholarship that fall. The first recipient was the daughter of a Marine who had died from complications related to burn pit exposure during his service in Iraq. She was planning to study nursing, hoping to work at VA hospitals to serve veterans like her father. At the scholarship award ceremony, Steve shared Marcus's story publicly for the first time, explaining how a phone call from a dying veteran had reminded him that fame and influence were meaningless unless they were used to help others when it mattered most. The response was overwhelming, with donations pouring in to support additional scholarships beyond the initial commitment. The segment that aired on Steve's talk show about Marcus Thompson and Jerome's journey to West Point became one of the most watched episodes in the show's history. Viewers responded not to the celebrity intervention, but to the raw authenticity of a father's love and a family's grace in the face of terminal illness. Military families across the country reached out to share similar stories of navigating bureaucratic challenges while dealing with serious illnesses. Veterans organizations praised Steve for highlighting the unique struggles facing military families. The segment won several awards, but more importantly, it sparked conversations about how society supports military families during their most vulnerable moments. 2 years after Marcus's death, Jerome Thompson completed his plebe year at West Point with honors. He returned to Detroit for summer break and visited Steve, who was in town for a comedy show. They met for dinner, and Jerome shared stories about the challenges and triumphs of his first year at the academy. He talked about the intensity of the training, the bonds formed with fellow cadets, the way his father's lessons about leadership and integrity had guided him through difficult moments. Steve listened with genuine interest, asking questions about Jerome's plans for military specialization and his long-term career goals. Jerome explained that he hoped to serve in the Corps of Engineers, building infrastructure in communities that needed it most, continuing his father's legacy of service in a different form. As their dinner concluded, Jerome said something that crystallized the entire experience for Steve. "You know, Mr. Harvey, my father taught me that character is revealed in how you respond when someone asks for help and you have the power to provide it. He said too many people with power use it for themselves, but the rare ones use it to lift others. You didn't have to help us. We were just another family that appeared on your show years ago. But you treated my father's request with respect and dignity. You used your influence to ensure his son got a fair chance. That's character, and that's what I aspire to as an officer." The story could end there, a touching tale of celebrity intervention helping a deserving young man. But the impact rippled far beyond one family. The Marcus Thompson Memorial Scholarship grew into a comprehensive program supporting dozens of military families annually. Steve's foundation partnered with veterans organizations to identify families facing similar challenges and provide not just financial support, but also advocacy when bureaucratic systems threatened to deny opportunities to qualified candidates. The program helped students navigate military academy applications, ROTC scholarship processes, and veterans' educational benefits. It provided tutoring, mentorship, and guidance from retired military officers who volunteered their time to ensure young people from military families had every opportunity to succeed. 5 years after Marcus's death, the foundation held a reunion event for all the scholarship recipients. Over 60 students attended, many of them now in military service themselves or pursuing careers in fields that served veterans and active duty personnel. Jerome Thompson, now a second lieutenant in the Army Corps of Engineers, spoke at the event about his father's legacy and Steve Harvey's role in honoring it. He announced that he was establishing his own scholarship fund within the program, donating a portion of his military salary to support one additional student annually. His mother, Patricia, who had become a volunteer with the foundation, stood beside him beaming with pride. Steve Harvey addressed the gathering with words that reflected how much the experience had changed his own perspective. When Marcus Thompson called me 5 years ago, he was asking for help with a specific problem. But what he really gave me was a reminder about why any of us are given platforms and influence. It's not for our own glory. It's not to be worshipped or admired. It's to be in a position to help when help is needed most. Marcus taught me that lesson, and Jerome has shown me what happens when you give young people the opportunity they've earned through merit and hard work. Every person in this room represents potential that might have been lost to bureaucracy or circumstance. Now you're all out there serving, building, healing, teaching, and making the world better. That's Marcus Thompson's legacy, and I'm honored to have played a small part in it. The attendees gave Steve a standing ovation that lasted several minutes, but he deflected the praise back to the students and their families. He spent the rest of the evening listening to their stories, learning about their challenges and achievements, connecting with people whose lives had been touched by a program that started with one desperate phone call from a dying father. As we close this remarkable story, it's worth reflecting on what it teaches us about compassion, responsibility, and the power of using whatever influence we have to help others. Steve Harvey could have politely declined Marcus Thompson's request or offered empty sympathy. Instead, he made calls, leveraged relationships, and followed through with ongoing support that changed not just one life but hundreds. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that kindness and action can make a real difference, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. We share stories like this because they remind us of the best of what humanity can be when we choose to help each other rather than look away. The challenge coin that Marcus Thompson gave to Steve Harvey remains in Steve's office, displayed prominently where he sees it every day. It sits next to a photo of Jerome Thompson in his dress gray West Point uniform, standing at attention during his induction ceremony. These items serve as daily reminders that television success, comedy fame, and entertainment achievements are all secondary to the impact you can have on individual lives when someone reaches out in desperation and you respond with genuine care and effective action. Marcus Thompson's story, his son's success, and the scholarship program that bears his name all stand as testament to a simple truth. When people with platforms choose to use their influence for good, when they respond to calls for help with action rather than excuses, the ripple effects can touch hundreds or thousands of lives in ways that far exceed any television ratings or social media metrics. Steve Harvey learned that lesson from a veteran who spent his final months fighting not for his own life, but for his son's future. That lesson continues to guide Steve's work and reminds him that the most important moments often happen not in front of cameras, but in quiet phone calls, hospital visits, and conversations with people who simply need someone to care enough to help.